Hey, and welcome to the first short lecture from Chapter 6 in your textbook. So today I want to talk to you about the symbolic nature of language, and in order to do this, we need to talk a little bit about semiotics. So as your book explains, semiotics is the study of everything that can be used for communication. So words, body language, the written word, semaphore, the communication we do with flags and so on. These can all be studied using semiotics. So this is the science of language and of communication. And the smallest unit, the equivalent of the atom in science, right? The smallest unit of meaning in semiotics is what we call the sign. And the sign is composed of two parts, the signifier and the signified. So the signifier is the image, object, or sound that we use to convey our message. So for example, in a situation where we're talking about a tree, the word tree would be the signifier. The signified is the concept that this signifier represents. So when I say tree, you get an idea of a tree in your head. And the idea of the tree that you see in your mind's eye is the signified. Now, it's important to recognize that the signified is different than an actual tree. The signified is actually the idea of the tree, or the image of the tree that you get in your mind. An actual tree is what we call the referent. So again, the sign is the smallest. The sign is the smallest unit within semiotics. And in theory, it can be divided further into the signifier and the signified. Right? Now, we call it the smallest unit, even though it can be divided only because it can be divided only in theory. Right? So in other words, we can't really get smaller than the sign unless we go to this theoretical abstraction of the signifier and the signified. So with regard to this, it's important to recognize that this relationship between the signifier, right, the word tree, and the signified, your idea of the tree, is entirely arbitrary. So by that, what we're saying is, for example, with this child, right, we call this a child, but there's nothing inherently about the child that makes it deserve that name. In other words, there's nothing childish about the child. We just all agree to call it a child. Another example might be something like a desk. So we all simply agree to call a desk a desk. There's nothing deskish about it. It's just a word that we've all agreed on means this thing that's a desk, right? Now we know this because we have different words for child and desk in different languages. So in English, this here is a child. In German, it's a kind. In Spanish, it's a bambino, or in Italian, it's a bambino. In Spanish, it's a niño. In French, it's an enfant, right? I mean, there's all these different words that we have to represent a child. It's the same thing with desk, right? In German, a desk is a Tisch, because that's the word that they all agreed means this thing that we call a desk. So in this sense, a word's meaning is derived entirely from its difference with other words, right? So the meaning isn't in the thing. The meaning isn't in the child. The meaning of child isn't found here. The meaning of child is largely defined by the fact that a child is different than an adult. Right? So again, the words that we use certainly mean things, but their meaning is largely arbitrary. In other words, it's just something we made up at random, and we all agree on, right? Now, one of the great powers of language as a form of communication comes from its symbolic nature. So language, of course, words are symbols, and these symbols allow us to communicate in ways that we wouldn't otherwise be able to. For example, the symbolic nature of language allows us to talk about ideas, reasons, time in different frames, the past, the future. It allows us to talk about things that aren't there. Indeed, language is so powerful that it allows us to talk about things where there is no referent, where there is no real object to which we're referring when we use these words. So, for example, if I talk about a unicorn, it's the power, the symbolic nature of language and the power that this gives language that allows me to talk about unicorns, because unicorns aren't real. And so this, again, is the power of language. This shows you what it can do. The same goes to speaking about things like the past and the future. Language is really, really powerful. So think about, how would you convey to someone, for example, that it's your birthday tomorrow without using language? I mean, you can't adequately, right? Because language is what allows us to talk about the future or the past instead of just right now. Right? So the symbolic nature of language makes it tremendously powerful. It allows us to reason and talk in ways that we wouldn't otherwise be able to. So while the symbolic nature of language has its benefits, right, it can also lead to problems. So, for example, a message that you send out might seem perfectly clear to you, but it might be confusing to others. And this is because, at least in part, meanings are in people and not in words. So we need to be mindful of the fact that words themselves have relatively little power. We are the ones who grant words power, who grant words meaning. There is no meaning inherent in words. Words are simply tools. They're really, really, really useful tools. But they're tools nonetheless. And so we're the ones who grant these words meaning. And of course, there are some words where we think we know what they mean, but maybe we don't. Or we each have a different idea of what words mean. And this, of course, is related to the symbolic nature of language again. So, for example, in English, I talk about love. So, and I use the same word to describe a whole bunch of different kinds of love. So, for example, I love my wife, I love my children, I love pizza. But I love all these things differently. Nevertheless, we use the same word. So, if I was sitting here talking about love, you might think that you understand what I mean. But in my mind, I'm talking about the love that I have for my wife, and in your mind, you're talking about the kind of love that applies to pizza. So you see, right, that the symbolic nature of language is very powerful because it allows us to talk about things that aren't real. It allows us to talk about ideas. It allows us to talk about the past and the future. But it also complicates things because there are words that are vague or ambiguous, that have multiple meanings. And ultimately, we need to understand that meanings are in people and not in words. This is, of course, why I think it's silly that many of us get upset about words. Curse words come to mind. You know, people get very upset over people using quote-unquote foul language. But the power of that language, right, is vested in the people who get offended, not in the words themselves. Something interesting to think about. All right, well, that's it for this first quick lecture. I hope you learned something. And next time we'll talk more about understandings and misunderstandings in communication as it relates to language. Thanks for checking this out.